Philp.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to start with fiscal responsibility, since the Chief Secretary is on the front bench. Madam Deputy Speaker, I think fiscal responsibility is a very important thing. For the sake of our children, if nothing else, I have two-year-old twins, and there is nothing noble or moral or ethical about consistently spending more than we can afford and sending the bill to the next generation. And moreover, as the Chancellor very eloquently put it earlier, without fiscal responsibility, we can't deliver the services that are so important. Clearly, a good start has been made to fixing the deficit left behind in 2010. About half of it's been eliminated. Members opposite are right to point out there is still more work to do in that regard. But at the same time, it doesn't seem entirely appropriate to give very angry lectures on this topic when every single measure proposed by the government over the last 5 years to reduce the deficit has been opposed by the side opposite. And in fact, had we followed their advice during the last Parliament, our national debt would be £900 billion higher than it currently is today. Now, my colleague on the Treasury Select Committee mentioned during his very thoughtful speech earlier, it suggested that high spending during the late 1940s and 1950s demonstrated that, in fact, you could spend money to grow. I'm afraid I dispute my honourable colleague's analysis, because that spending spree ended in 1976 when we had to go to the IMF with our cap in hand. And even Dennis Healey, the then Chancellor of the Exchequer, said you can't spend your way out of a recession, a lesson I think we would do well to remember. Madam, of course I will.
My point was not to go into the 70s, but a very specific period of the 1950s, when national debt as a share of GDP was significantly higher, twice as high in many years than now. That did not lead to a burden on the generation that was young then, which is my generation, which in fact is extremely well off as a result of that. I was trying to point out the issue of whether borrowing per se disbenefits future generations. It doesn't. It depends how you spend the money.
Well, I must say I very respectfully disagree with my colleague on the Treasury Select Committee's conclusion. I think if you look at the economic performance in the 1960s and 1970s, that enormous debt overhang, the state spending too much money, was a drag on the economy, and its culmination was that 1976 bailout. That was the natural conclusion of the overspending that started in the 1950s and continued through that post-war consensus period, which only ended in 1979. Let me come on to the second main criticism levelled at the budget by members opposite, and that is one of fairness. I'm afraid to say I disagree with the comments made over the weekend by my right honourable friend from Chingford and Wood Green. I do think this is a fair budget, and let me produce some evidence to substantiate that. Firstly, spending on disability benefits over the last 5 years has in fact increased by £3 billion and is forecast to increase further. That strikes me as fundamentally fair. We're spending more on the NHS than we ever have before. We're spending more on education than we ever have before, particularly on pupils from low-income backgrounds via the pupil premium. Moreover, we're introducing the highest ever national minimum wage, the national living wage, which takes effect in about a week's time. We've taken millions of people out of income tax entirely, which disproportionately benefits people on low incomes, and we've frozen petrol duty once again, also disproportionately benefiting people on low incomes, because things like petrol duty are inherently regressive. If we consult the government's or the Treasury's distributional analysis, we will see that the amount of tax paid by the lowest 20% of earners at just 6%. You would expect it to be 20% if it was even, but it's just 6%. Same in 2019-20 as it is in 2010. And the top quintile will be paying 52%, up from 49% 5 years ago. So the highest earners will in fact be paying proportionately more in 5 years' time than they were 5 years ago. And I would add that this analysis excludes the effect of the national minimum wage. If one includes that in the analysis, the skew will go even further. So I believe this budget is a fair budget. It protects spending on the most vulnerable. Those with the broadest shoulders are bearing the burden. And Madam Deputy Speaker, let me turn briefly to business. I spent 15 years before coming here setting up and running entrepreneurial businesses. The reason our economy has created 2.4 million jobs in the last 5 years, the reason in Croydon South, my constituency, youth unemployment is down an incredible 62%, is not an accident. It's not an accident, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's because corporation tax has been cut. It has encouraged businesses to invest in creating jobs. And I am delighted the Chancellor is continuing this very successful long-term economic plan with which I see commands widespread support, with further cuts to corporation tax and capital gains tax to encourage investment. And again, if I can turn to my colleague on the Treasury Select Committee, he suggested that lower corporation tax encourage share buybacks, and this is a bad thing. I would respectfully suggest that share buybacks cycle money back in to the investor community who can then reinvest in other opportunities. Madam Deputy Speaker, I moreover welcome the government's action on international tax evasion via the BEPS initiative, although I would suggest the government could potentially sort of forerun that with further moves on transparency and disclosure unilaterally in the UK, as has been suggested. Madam Deputy Speaker, in the remaining few seconds, I'd like to make one or two further suggestions. There's a consultation document to give the Financial Policy Committee further powers to direct buy-to-let mortgage lending, which appears to be very high. I would urge the government to look very seriously at those proposals and enact them at the earliest opportunity. Madam Deputy Speaker, I support this budget. It's good for business, it's good for our country, and most of all, it's fair.
Jim Cunningham.